My name is Mark Sedra, and I'm a Senior Fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Canada. And I'll be laying out what I think the term should be for the debate that will determine the future of Canada's engagement in Afghanistan. First and foremost, I think that debate has to recognize two fundamental points. Number one, despite the deteriorating security situation and rising political tensions, particularly in the aftermath of the disputed presidential election, much has been accomplished over the past 8 years in Afghanistan. Almost every development indicator has shown some improvement. Millions of refugees have returned to the country, and there's been relatively robust economic growth. Secondly, there has to be broad recognition that rebuilding a failed state, any failed state, particularly one as troubled as Afghanistan, can take a very long time, decades. With this in mind, I think it's important to recalibrate our expectations for Afghanistan. The country is not going to be transformed into the Switzerland of the Hindu Kush in this lifetime, and it may take decades for it to reach the level of, in terms of stability and development, of a country like Bangladesh or even Nepal. According to this logic, I think that there has to be broad acceptance that it's going to take decades to rebuild and reconstruct Afghanistan, maybe even a generation. Now, this debate also has to consider four key issues. First, there has to be a comprehensive political strategy for Afghanistan. The last major international donor conference for the country took place in early 2006 in London, which resulted in the signing of the Afghanistan Compact, a document that contained a vision for the reconstruction and state-building process in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, that vision really didn't imbue the process with the purpose and clarity that it was lacking. It's my belief that another donor conference held in the months or year ahead can in fact provide the process with that purpose and clarity. Now, to do so, it will have to clearly lay out benchmarks and objectives that are both realistic and concise. Moreover, it's absolutely critical that that any agreement that would result from this conference establish new terms for an invigorated partnership between the international donor community and the Afghan administration. Now, the second issue is that there will never be peace and stability in Afghanistan without a framework for regional cooperation. And it's my firm belief that the time is right to establish such a framework. Pakistan is in the midst of a very bloody war against its own Taliban militants, and there are signs that the relationship between Washington and Tehran is beginning to thaw. Now, this framework would ideally be overseen by the United Nations and would include not only all of Afghanistan's immediate neighbors, but also regional powers like Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, as well as the United States. And it's important to note that that framework shouldn't just focus on security issues, dynamics, and threats, but also focus on promoting economic cooperation in the region, which would be a boon for development in Afghanistan. The third issue is that Afghanistan must be provided with the tools to provide for its own security. The current size of the Afghan National Security Forces just doesn't allow for this. In line with the recommendation of General Stanley McChrystal in his recent report, I believe that the Afghan National Security Forces, the size should be doubled. From its current force ceiling of roughly 200,000 police and soldiers to over 400,000. Now, that's going to involve a significant cost for the international community, both in the short term to rapidly expand and accelerate the train and equip program, but also in the long term, because the Afghan government, with its very meager revenue generating capacity, just doesn't have the financial wherewithal to support such a large force. So it will have to rely on pretty substantial international subsidies. Now, this is a lot to ask of the international community, but when you consider the fact that according to some estimates, the deployment of one NATO soldier is roughly equivalent to the cost of training and equipping 5 or even 7 Afghan National Army soldiers, then it's clear that this is the most cost-effective and sustainable solution. Now, the last issue that I think is very critical relates to the emerging reality that there is just no military solution to the Afghan conflict, and that there is a broad need for a very robust process of political reconciliation. Now, that process should not only target receptive members of the Taliban movement and disgruntled factional actors, but should also reach out to traditional leaders and authorities who have often felt detached from the political happenings in Kabul, but whose involvement in the political life of the country and the political process is so critical for stability and sustainable development. Now, there have been a number of initiatives launched over the last few years to advance reconciliation, but they really haven't been of the magnitude needed or have been adequately Afghan-owned and internationally backed to make a real difference. Now, to conclude, I would remind those engaged in this debate over Canada's future in Afghanistan that Canada's involvement is part of a multilateral enterprise. And as such, determining the future course of that involvement has to involve in a very frank assessment of the resolve of Canada's NATO and donor partners to stay the course. Because, of course, that will determine the efficacy of future Canadian aid and assistance. Moreover, I think it's important to remind Canadians that Canada can make a serious contribution to Afghanistan's future and to the stability of Afghanistan outside of the military sphere. There are a number of avenues in terms of civilian assistance, whether it's supporting the development of the Afghan National Security Forces, promoting governance reforms in the Afghan public administration, or implementing development projects where Canada can make a difference. And this is something that we have to remain cognizant of and consider in our options for the future. Now, finally, it is my firm belief that success on some level can be achieved in Afghanistan in the years ahead. But that will require a firm commitment and also requires Canada and its international partners to address the issues that I've raised here, which will create the conditions where success will be possible, an enabling environment for success to be achieved. Most fundamentally, there is a need for a firm commitment to the future of Afghanistan, a long-term commitment if Canada decides to stay engaged in the country, because the time for half measures and partial commitments is long past. Thank you very much for your time.